Good evening, everybody. It's nice to see you all here again. My name is Philip Kennedy, and I'm really delighted to be here hosting Annia Ciezadlo, who's here for 3 weeks, actually teaching at NYU in one of our intensive J terms, so-called J terms, which means a January term, a course which is called Food in the Global Kitchen. And it's a course actually we'll talk a bit about, because I don't think there are many people who write more incisively and with such both wit and intelligence about the nature of food in our lives and the politics of food, the sociology of food, the anthropology of food, the history of food, the importance of food to human beings. Really, the title of her book, Day of Honey, a Memoir of Love, of Food, Love and War, it really identifies a triptych or a triplet of ideas that really are extremely important, and they go very well together. And she makes that clear in her writings in a very subtle way. And that, again, like her course, is something we hope to get into it through the course of this conversation this evening. So let me just say a bit about, give a more formal introduction to Annia, even though really the whole of this conversation is about Annia and her work and her interests, and that's a fantastic thing for us to be able to do. She is a freelance foreign correspondent who specializes in writing about food and politics in the Middle East and elsewhere. She lived in the Middle East for most of the past decade, during which she was a special correspondent for the Christian Science Monitor in Baghdad between 2003 and 2004, and also the New Republic in Beirut between 2005 and 2007. During this time, she wrote groundbreaking articles about Baghdad's graffiti wars, militant Islamist poetry slams, the flight of the country's Christian minority, parliamentary quotas for women, and Iraq's first reality TV show. Since then, she has reported on revolutions in Lebanon, crackdowns in Syria, repression in Iraqi Kurdistan, the 2006 war between Israel and Hezbollah, and a host of other articles, which have appeared in all the major journalistic outlets, of course, Foreign Affairs, the New York Times, Granta, Newsweek, and Time, where she recently published an article on harissa, the dish harissa, which we will hopefully get a chance to talk about, which will allow us to evoke that historical arc that really underpins a lot of your writing, because really Annia is so aware of the historical background that underlies food in our daily lives. Her book, then, to say something more formal about it, Day of Honey, a Memoir of Food, Love and War, was hailed by the New York Times as, quote, among the least political and most intimate and valuable to have come out of the Iraq War. It has been translated into 4 languages and won numerous awards, including the American Book Award, the Dayton Literary Peace Prize, non-fiction runner-up in that category, the Barnes & Noble Discover Great New Writers Award, the Books for a Better Life Award, and the James Beard Foundation Book Award. And let me just add a personal note to this. I can only endorse any award that the book is given. It's a wonderful book. And I really encourage anybody who can to get hold of a copy. It's really quite unique in its take on the Middle East by taking a subject that's so familiar to us, but really something that's taken for granted. It really opens up perspectives that are very subtle, but also very meaningful, and go to the heart of what we are as human beings. It's also written brilliantly, with great wit, and effortlessly. That's the great secret in writing, is to be able to write effortlessly so that it seems that it was effortless.
But it wasn't.
When you read it, even though you know it wasn't, and it went through many drafts. In any case, to get started, I don't want to be the one talking. We want to hear Annia speak. But let me begin by posing a question to her, actually by reading out an epigraph to her course. And I'm not quoting an Arab author, but in fact George Orwell from The Road to Wigan Pier. To quote Orwell, I think it could be plausibly argued that changes of diet are more important than changes of dynasty or even religion. The Great War, for instance, could never have happened if tin food had not been invented. Yet it is curious how seldom the all-importance of food is recognized. You see statues everywhere to politicians, poets, bishops, but none to cooks or bacon curers or market gardeners, end quote. So, Annia, could I ask you to tell us a bit about what that quote means to you and why you used it?
Why I chose it? Well, that would have been an epigraph to my book had not Bill Buford used it as an epigraph to his book, unfortunately. So I had to use Ronald Reagan, but that's another story, and you can buy the book and find out what Reagan had to say about food. George Orwell, I always introduce him as the world's most underappreciated food writer. He's definitely, being a bit of a materialist, was in the sense of someone who takes the material world seriously, not in the Madonna sense. He often mentioned food in his writing about poverty, and also in his writing about war and history and politics. And so that quote was incredibly formative to me when I first read it many years ago, when I was a high school student, reading everything I could by George Orwell, when I first figured out that he actually was one of the masters of expository prose, in addition to being the guy who wrote Animal Farm in 1984. And it informed my understanding of food as something that is not merely a consumer product or a commodity, not merely a lifestyle choice, but something that also has implications and that has importance for all of those different ologies that Philip mentioned, sociology, anthropology, theology. Any ology you got, food connects to it in some way or another. And so it was actually, as I said before, it was one of the things that I wanted to use as an epigraph for the book, but it's almost like it informs the entire spirit of the book and much of my writing.
Mm-hmm. Great. So, talk a bit about the genesis of the book. I mean, just to give an idea for those of you who haven't read it, it's really divided into 4 parts.
5.
5 parts, including the epilogue.
Yes.
Right. So, but it talks a bit about Annia's upbringing. She was born in La Grange, Illinois.
Outside
there
of
until
Chicago.
13. Right? And then at 13 you became very peripatetic and ended up in Arizona, the Bay region, San Francisco, St. Louis, Missouri. At some point you ended up in
Kansas.
Buffalo,
New
New York, and then you sort of drifted down to New York. But I'm sure there's a teleology in all of this. But so the first part of the book is really about your upbringing, and you identify the fact that you were always somehow interested in food.
And the travels, as you correctly figured, had a lot to do with that. I became, when you travel a lot, especially when you travel a lot as a sort of a young person who maybe wants to be more connected to one place or another, particularly when you're in high school, it's hard to leave your friends at that age. You become very attached to a sense of place, and you want to feel like you belong in the place where you are. And food, for me, became this instant way to do that. People who have moved a lot from one place to another often become very attuned to food. And a lot of us look, and Abu Dhabi is actually a really interesting place to look at that. The UAE in general, there are a lot of people here from somewhere else, and immediately when you come to a place, if you've traveled a lot, you want to know what is the food of that place, where's the good food, where is the characteristic food of that place, which can sometimes be very, very hard to figure out and to determine. And sometimes it's a matter of mere self-interest and staying alive and staying interested in the world, but it can often be a way of learning about a new environment and feeling that you belong. There's an almost, I would say like an almost spiritual or religious aspect to this idea that if you eat the product of the land, you will in a sense become part of it. It will become part of you. This concept of, I'm Catholic, so I tend to be obsessed with the idea of the Eucharist. But you have this idea that by consuming something, you then become part of it. And for me, that was a real imperative, moving as I was from place to place. And I came up with this idea of an edible map, which informs a lot of the book. It was, for me and my mother, who I did a lot of this traveling with, it was really important to us to immediately find out where the market was. When we moved to St. Louis, Missouri, for example, there's a great covered market that's very similar to a lot of the covered markets here in the Middle East, actually. 4 parts, kind of like this cross shape. When I went to Souk Hamidiyya in Damascus, I was like, oh my God, it's just like Soulard Market in St. Louis. And in fact, a lot of these markets have these ancient designs that we would recognize across continents, interestingly enough. So that was the first place that we discovered and the first place that we sought out. We heard about it, we went and we found it, and we, sort of try to find the food that's the freshest and that's the most characteristic, and that's also going to make you feel the most like you know where you are. And it's interesting, we were talking in class the other day. You can have the opposite experience as well. Sometimes I would find something that was characteristically Chicago, like Vienna dogs is a certain kind of hot dog they have in Chicago with hot peppers on it, and pickles and lots of other things. And poppy seed rolls, those are very important. It has to be a poppy seed bun. And that can also be really important too when you travel around a lot, to find food that is not characteristic of the place where you are, but characteristic of the place that you have left and that you miss. And that can become something in the nature of a quest or a mission often when you're in a foreign land or a different state or even just a neighborhood that you're not used to. So that was kind of a big motivator for me, and that's why I put a lot of my early history in the book, because I wanted people to be able to identify with this idea of constantly moving and sort of not really knowing where is home exactly, that I think a lot of us can identify with.
Mm-hmm. So just to go on and give a bit of the shape of the book for everybody who hasn't read it. That's the first part, and that first part takes you into New York, really, where one thing I want to say now is and it's important, I think it's a love story, your book, and it's the most subtle love story I think that's ever been written, in some sense. And for that, it's extremely moving, because when things are subtle, they are all the more moving. And if that sounds mysterious, there might be some moments where we explain what I mean. But in any case, you take us to New York, and then you move to Beirut with Mohammed. I forgot whether he was your...
We were married by then.
You were married by then, yes. So you went to Beirut. You were following Mohammed there, because he was soon to be appointed to Baghdad, and it's really in Baghdad where the book takes off, this period where you were there during the aftermath of Desert Storm, or whatever it was.
It was the aftermath of a war, but it was also the before-math of a war, or the math of a war, really. It was that kind of strange moment where, theoretically, on paper, the war was over, right? Mm-hmm. Mission accomplished. We all remember Bush strutting around with his flight suit. But it wasn't accomplished, and the war wasn't over. And so a lot of that part of the book is that realization. But it was also, and I think it's important for us to remember this, it was also a time of great hope for Iraqis and for people in Iraq. Late 2003 was a period of time when I think maybe things could have worked. I do actually think that. I don't think that what happened later was inevitable. And it was very important for me when I was writing this, which was, years later, to say, hey, there was this moment, and there was all this hope, and that should be remembered. It should be noted, and it should be known. Because in a sense, it makes it even more tragic what happened later. We tend to forget the way wars go. When a war becomes unpopular, as it always does, we then later kind of almost have this historical amnesia that there was a period of time when a vast majority of the American public, or at least so it seemed at the time, thought that the war was really a good thing and that we should do it. We forget that with every war that happens. There's a great verse by the pre-Islamic poet Imrul Qais, and I can't remember exactly how it goes. I don't know. It goes in Arabic. You might know. War is at first so much like a pretty girl, and then he goes on about the pretty girl. Something her treasures to unfurl, and then as it goes on, she becomes like a hag bent with age and hideous to touch or to behold. It's a little misogynist, but we can cut him some slack since it was a couple thousand years ago. And that pattern of a war really is consistent across the board. It's interesting. My husband teaches a Middle East class, and he was telling me the other day, you know, for a lot of his students, a lot of the students didn't live through that period when the current Iraq War, never mind the 1991 Iraq War, when that was the going thing, when that was what everyone wanted to do, when you could be, you know, roundly criticized for very hesitantly saying, hey, maybe this isn't the greatest idea after all. I don't know if anyone remembers the Dixie Chicks who were criticizing the war and the president who took us into it, and you know, that was a big deal. They suffered greatly from having the temerity to do that. And when the war becomes unpopular, we tend to forget that it was once popular. Anyway.
So you were there until 2005 during those, I mean, really, I mean, it was an
till mid-2004.
Right, and then you went back to Beirut.
And, oh, actually, no, till the end of 2004. Yeah, you're right.
And then you went to Beirut and spent about 2 years looking for an apartment. And then experienced the war in 2006. So then you lived in Beirut, which forms the third part of the book, or fourth.
Third and fourth.
But the point is, and then you have the epilogue. So what I want to get to the point, the genesis of the book.
Right.
You told me in conversation that, in fact, when you were in that time, that after having left Beirut, Baghdad, when you were in Beirut, you were thinking of writing a book about Beirut, in fact, and it was going to be a kind of year in Provence, but about you in Beirut. But then you ended up writing this book, which is about as much about Baghdad, and indeed you seem to think that Baghdadi part of the book is the most important. So how did you end up getting from the idea of a year in Provence to Day of Honey, and which of course introduces the subject of food so importantly into your thinking and writing?
Yes, it's a really interesting question, because I don't know if I would say that the Iraq part is the most important part of the book. I don't know, but it definitely is necessary. And I had originally thought that, you know, I wouldn't include it. Mohammed and I had spent about a year and a half in Iraq at this point, and if you read the book, you'll see how depressing it was to watch things really deteriorate there, to watch our friends become, you know, to watch people's relatives die, people's lives basically be destroyed very slowly, but very surely, to watch everything pretty much go to hell, and to watch all that hope that was initially there, all that hope and that excitement and that anticipation, to watch that basically just kind of go down the drain. And so after a year and a half, we said, you know, this is a really important story, and it's been really, you know, good that we covered it, and it's good and necessary work, but we need a bit of a break, and we need to sort of live like normal people. We need a taste of normal life. And so we went back and we decided we would spend some time in Beirut, and that was January of 2005. And for those of you who follow Lebanese politics, we had about 2 weeks of normal life until February 14th, 2005, when the former prime minister of Lebanon was assassinated. And things just became very, very interesting from then on, in the sense of, you know, may you live in interesting times. So the next year and a half was a time of a lot of political upheaval. Some of it was good. A lot of it was very stressful. There were a lot of assassinations. There was a lot of political unrest. There was a lot of tension, I guess, is the best way to put it. There was in Lebanon, a lot of people refer to the civil war, which was not one war, but many small wars, as the events. So during this period of 2005 to 2006, 2007, 2008, there were a lot of events. And during the middle of these events, I was sitting in our furnished hotel room, which sounds very luxurious, but it actually wasn't. And I had gone to the market and gotten this huge pile of greens, and just like wild fennel, and this thing called khubezi, that's like a wild mallow. It's Latin name Malva sylvestris. It's eaten widely throughout the Levant and Turkey and Greece. And they were all kind of piled up on the counter, and I was looking at them and thinking, my God, these things are so beautiful, and there's such a wealth of wonderful things that can be made with them. and such creativity and just so life-affirming in every way. And why doesn't anyone in the West, meaning mainly the English-speaking world, why doesn't anyone talk about this stuff or hear about this stuff? If you live in the United States, your association, your entire picture of the Middle East tends to be, you know, angry guys, and they're all guys, in dishdashas, jumping up and down, shouting Allahu Akbar, and maybe things blowing up in the background, and that's it. That is it. And you get the idea that there's really only men in the Middle East, and they're really only ever wearing dishdashas, and they're only ever shouting Allahu Akbar, and nothing else ever happens. So why don't we talk about all this other stuff? And I had this idea, like suddenly, like I think someone had been mentioning Year in Provence, or it had been, you know, sort of in the back of my mind. Why doesn't anyone write about everyday life? And this is something I'd wondered about a lot in Baghdad as well during the war, because I had tried to consistently write about things like food and cooking and commuting and kids going to school and people making cakes. People in Baghdad like cake. Who knew? My friends in New York would always be really surprised. They'd be like, really, they eat cake? I'm like, yeah, they have cake. They were colonized by the British, but really even people who weren't colonized by the British tend to have cake. You know, there was cake even before the Brits came, but there was more after they came. So you know, people were always really surprised by this kind of stuff. And so I thought, wouldn't it be cool to write a book that was sort of like a Year in Provence, but in Lebanon? And I would talk about the seasons and the plants and the farmers, and there's this tradition in Lebanon of preserving food, and there's a name for both the act of preserving food, but also for the preserves that result from this act of preserving food. Arabic has a lot of these kind of words that are both the verb and the noun, and it's called mune, and I write about it a lot. And so I thought it would be great, this thing about people preserving food, and it would be very lovely and wonderful, and it would give readers like this whole new image of the Middle East, and it would be kind and gentle and lovely and life-affirming. And it took me 2 years to even write the book proposal and to sort of figure out how to do that and to get an agent and all these sort of mechanics of writing a book. And during those 2 years, there was many more assassinations happened. Peaceful uprising against Syrian rule in Lebanon was sort of already underway when I had the idea. The 2006 war between Israel and Hezbollah, which is extremely short, but extremely violent and extremely nasty and ugly. All of these things happened while I was in the process of writing the proposal. And if any of you want to write a book, like, come talk to me afterwards. Well, you know, there's a lot of things you need to know before you set about doing this. And so it took me 2 years. During those 2 years, all of these things happened that made me realize I can't write about the love of life and all of these life-affirming things that cooking centers around: food, family, communion, keeping each other alive. I can't write about all this stuff happening in the Middle East without also acknowledging the other side of the coin. And so that's why it ended up not being a year in Beirut, and why it ended up being a very different sort of book. And I'm glad that it didn't, because I think it would have been, in a sense, not quite honest to only write about the happy, life-affirming side of things. But that was the genesis of the book as it came to be.
Great, thanks. So can we, well, let me suggest now that you read a passage from the Baghdad period of the book, period of your life, actually. I don't know if you want to say something about, to contextualize what you're going to read, or just to read it and say something.
Okay. Well, there's a couple of passages that I could read. And I could leave it up to the audience, or I could just be a dictator and decide which one I'm going to read. I think I'm going to start off being a dictator, and maybe I'll sort of mellow a bit. I'm going to read a passage about Mutanabbi Street, which is my favorite street in Baghdad, and obviously named after the great, I want to say 10th?
Al-Mutanabbi.
Yeah, what century was he?
10th century.
Okay, 10th century poet. This is the street in Baghdad where they sold books. And it was still very, very active as a sort of a market of books when I got there in mid to late 2003. The Persians represent paradise as a walled garden. My idea of paradise is more like Mutanabbi Street in Baghdad's old city, an entire city street with no cars, just books and cafes. Every Friday, book and paper merchants laid down blankets and sheets of plastic, covered them with books, magazines, and newspapers, and hawked the written word as if it was potatoes or watermelons. The entire street and parts of the sidewalk were paved with books, used and new. books of spells, religion, poetry, proverbs, and propaganda. It was like a giant horizontal library, an earthly garden of books. And not just books. In Mutanabi Street, you could buy anything and everything that had to do with writing or paper. Green and gold embossed Qurans, giant posters of Imam Hussein holding his dying infant son pierced with arrows by the soldiers of Yazid at the Battle of Karbala. Glue sticks, pens with fuzzy feather heads, and inflatable armchairs for children. Spiral notebooks with fluffy white kittens, gamboling puppies, and vampy women batting dark-lashed eyes. Engineering textbooks. The Oxford Guide to Phrasal Verbs. Teach yourself English phrase books nestled among handbooks of archaic tongues like Pascal and Basic and COBOL. And for reasons I never divined, copy after yellowing copy of the Journal of Heat Transfer. Like 1 million copies of that in Baghdad, I don't know why. Rows and rows of vintage Time and Newsweek, a few of them old enough to have Nixon on the cover. Ancient copies of Playboy and Hustler jostled for sidewalk space with back issues of Flex and other bodybuilding magazines. Mutanabi Street was also known for books of spells and sorcery, for putting curses on rivals or enemies. These were banned under Saddam, who feared black magic might succeed where CIA-backed coup attempts had failed. And according to my friend Usama, some of them sold for thousands of dollars. The Ba'ath Party had imposed controls on book imports in 1970. After that, no books could enter the country legally without government approval, and the number of books coming into Iraq dwindled. The booksellers still came to Mutanabi under the Ba'ath, but the books they could sell were more tightly controlled, and some were contraband. My favorite books in Mutanabi were the samizdat copies of books that used to be outlawed, like 1984 and Animal Farm. These were tiny, the size of poetry chapbooks, easy to hide or jettison if necessary. Mimeographed on cheap, shiny paper and stapled together crookedly, they were barely more than the idea of a book, stripped down to the barest element of thoughts moving on paper. It was hard to believe that these faint purple words, already fading, once held the power to jail or even execute their readers. And yet people had read them nonetheless. The crowds that packed Mutanabi Street showed every Friday how hungry Baghdad was to sample these formerly forbidden fruits. Most of the books were in Arabic, but inside the dusty little bookstores you could find plenty of English language paperbacks piled in perpetually collapsing towers. E.M. Forster, Herman Melville, English translations of famous Iraqi writers, even Wilfred Thesiger's classic ethnography of southern Iraq, the Marsh Arabs. Then there were the stacks and stacks of dusty, faded romance novels from Mills and Boon, Harlequin's British cousin. The first time we went to Mutanabi, Rawa, this is my translator and friend, bought a 6-inch pile of battered 1970s romance novels. This is Mutanabi Street. Their covers blazed with craggy men and bosomy women clinching in front of purple mountains and heaving seas. People laugh at me for these, she said, putting them in her bag. But in fact, it is from these books that I learned how to speak English. Rawa had not been able to attend the English language high school where the sons and daughters of Baghdad's elite chattered in perfect American accents. But Mutanabi's bookstores functioned like lending libraries. For a small deposit, she could check out a book or two, devour them at home, and bring them back the next week and trade them in for more. After years of studying her borrowed bodice rippers, she spoke English as fluently as any Ba'athist apparatchik's daughter. Mutanabi Street was a great equalizer. The heart of Mutanabi was its cafes, the most famous of which were Hassan Ajami and Shah Bandar. Like those on Abu Nawas Street, the cafes housed a culture of intellectual curiosity that cut across sectarian and ethnic identities. They were part of a tradition of public discussion and debate that stretched all the way back to medieval Baghdad. Shah Bandar, which is this picture, was my favorite tea house, close to a century old, on the corner of Mutanabi Street. Inside the cafe, bird cages hung from the high ceilings. Gossip floated upwards on cigarette smoke, staining the lofty light blue and white painted walls with the fumes of ancient literary feuds. The whole room was glazed a comforting sepia from a century of nicotine. On the walls, there were colorful paintings of old Baghdad streets with their overhanging balconies, pastel paintings of mosques, a drawing of the Grand Mosque in Mecca inscribed with the Shahada, the Muslim profession of faith, a watercolor of the family tree of the Prophet Muhammad in reds and blues, and the 99 names of God printed in Arabic calligraphy. Faded black and white photographs told the story of Iraq's tragic 20th century. Here was a picture of King Faisal I, the Hashemite chieftain the British installed as Iraq's king in 1921, his reward for leading the Arab revolt against the Ottomans. Next to it hung a picture of Faisal's young son Ghazi, a little boy dwarfed on a great throne, his feet barely reaching the ground. A little further down the wall, another photo showed the massive 1939 funeral of the flamboyant, beloved 27-year-old Ghazi, by then king of Iraq, killed in a convenient car crash as he grew increasingly critical of British control of the supposedly independent Iraqi state. Shall I continue? Yeah? Okay. I always ran into somebody I knew at Shah Bandar. Basim the sculptor, who's actually in this picture. Nasir, a poet I knew from the Najin group. Reem's husband Sadiq, and always holding court in his usual spot on a worn white wooden bench against the back wall by the kitchen, Abu Rifat, otherwise known as the Professor, Graffiti Man, King of Graffiti, Wall Hunter, and the Virgil of Baghdad. When I look at my photographs of Abu Rifat, I don't see a person so much as a hurricane. He could never stay still long enough to have his picture taken, and so a lone eye peers distractedly out of a blur of whirling cheeks and chins. The pink tip of a fleshy nose holds a graying mustache in place. The rest of him reels as he turns from one side to the other in mid-sentence, the better to speak to everybody at once. Black plastic glasses jammed crookedly across his nose, black watch cap mashed down over his bald pink pate, muffled in layers of ragged sweaters and jackets like a woolly snowman. This you must try, he decided on my third or fourth visit, after peering at me for a few seconds and trying to remember which of his courtiers I might be. It is a traditional tea, an Iraqi tea, rolling the R in Iraqi, holding up a finger, the very best tea of all. In vain, I protested that I had already ordered and drunk an ocean of tea. I was speaking to the air. He was already gone. He bustled back in with a glass of pale tea. This, he said, presenting it to me with a flourish, this, believe me, is the real tea of Iraq. It looked oily, dense, and yellow, like a glass of melted topaz. It tasted musty and bittersweet, an antique taste, like drinking old history books. It was called hamul, which means sour, and it was made from numi Basra, the little sun-dried key limes historically imported from Persia through the southern Iraqi port of Basra. Here, you probably know them as lumi omani, by the way. They're quite common. They're like the little limes that you get at many restaurants here. Abu Rifat had spent most of his life as a radar operator in the Iraqi army. Once he retired, he became a full-time scholar of the word. Medieval Iraqi poets went to the Basra souk to learn the desert Arabic of the Bedouin. 12 centuries later, Abu Rifat haunted the cafes and streets of Baghdad, compiling massive, heavily annotated guides to the strongly flavored expressions of Iraqi speech, the proverbs, idioms, jokes, graffiti, and slang. All of them are alive, he told me as we sat in Shah Bandar, waving his hand around the cafe, because they are circulating in places like this. I never saw Abu Rifat without a stack of books. He would pile them on one of Shah Bandar's little linoleum tea tables, a rusty old copy of Cricket magazine with the cover torn off, a ragged 1950s-era primer on business English, and Chicken Soup for the Soul. This he considered second only to Uncle John's Bathroom Reader, a compendium of trivia, stories, and odd little facts that he often held up as proof of the beauty of American literature. They write things that are so beautiful, you cannot find anything like this in any other country, he told me. For example, the Bathroom Reader. It is so beautiful. It is not a book, it is a university. It contains everything beautiful. In the Middle East, folk stories chronicle the misadventures of a wise fool, a trickster named Juha or Nasruddin, or in Lebanon, Abu Abid. In America, the storytelling tradition lived on in compilations of urban legends and little self-help fables, like Chicken Soup for the Soul. Abu Rifat loved America and everything it produced. His father started it. If an American movie aired at night on television, he would wake up the children, shaking their shoulders gently. Look, watch, James Cagney, Jimmy Stewart. Later, Abu Rifat discovered something even better than Hollywood, American literature. Jacqueline Suzanne, Harold Robbins, Sidney Sheldon, and Barbara Taylor Bradford. Books were his key to America, the dream world that kept him going through the long, lonely years in the Iraqi army. We need the artists because they make life so beautiful, he said to me once in Shah Bandar. I don't know why the journalists laugh at me when I tell them I love Sidney Sheldon. His writing, it is so beautiful. You know, one of his books, I read it 22 times before I was satisfied. I never made fun of Abu Rifat's taste in books. In Baghdad, you read whatever you could find. I scored an old paperback of Moby Dick in Mutanabi Street and John Dos Passos' entire USA trilogy in one volume. But I was equally excited to find a flaking old copy of Bud Schulberg's boxing novel, The Harder They Fall, with a pulpy cover that growled, rough and tough, smelling of blood and lust. That was America too, and we all need to escape sometimes.
Thank you. Thank you. So do we need to, is there another image here? This is
That's
still...
also the inside of Shah Bandar.
Yes. And there again.
Yes.
So Abu Rifat, of course, he's like a number of characters. You do fabulous portraits of people, and that was one of the portraits. And you're very subtle about the way you make food a leitmotif of the book. Mm-hmm. So there's not much of food there, except that there is an idea that food is food for thought, or the idea of the textual banquet, which goes back to Adab, the medieval Arabic literature. We'll talk a bit about in a minute. But there's one point when, later in the book, I think the last time Abu Rifat appears, that you encounter him at a low point. You hadn't been eating, rather than eating, you were smoking cigarettes. Muhammad had gone off to Beirut, and he made things better for you that day by
feeding me.
By feeding you.
By showing me the real food of Iraq.
And was it?
It was, actually. It was, yeah. Although it was called Banadoura Shami, which means Syrian tomatoes, but it's like a very Iraqi, Baghdadi thing. Oh. So he did this in a sense, like, sort of, he sensed that I was not like, also known as chili fry, by the way. I found this out many years later from an Iraqi cookbook writer. She was like, oh yeah, chili fry. Some people call it Banadoura Shami, but it's really Iraqi. He fed me that day, and it was definitely this sort of like chicken soup for the soul moment, because he sensed correctly that I wasn't taking care of myself. And so one of the themes of the book is people using food to take care of each other. And he was very, he had kids, and his kids were actually abroad, and so I think he sort of missed being a parent, and having someone to take care of. And I certainly missed having someone to take care of me. And so it was like this lovely moment. And he was very into also sharing Iraqi culture with people from outside. He had always kind of craved this contact with the outside world, growing up in this very, very isolated, hermetically sealed world that was Iraq under Saddam. And so for him, it was this wonderful opportunity to sort of show all these foreigners the glory of Iraqi culture, since he had been enjoying the glories of American culture for so long. Mm-hmm. So the passage that I just read, this idea of adab, of being sort of learned discourse, we tend to think of literature as being only high art, right, and high literature, and high culture. But if you read Plato and Aristotle and a lot of what we think of as high culture and high literature, what is Plato, right? Like Plato's dialogues? What's going on in Plato's dialogues? This is a bunch of guys sitting around drinking a lot and eating and kind of, shooting the breeze, right? So I'm not really sure that these distinctions that we make necessarily apply. I see Abu Rifat as, sort of a modern day Al-Jahiz in his own way, particularly in his interest in both high and low culture and his sort of practice. He would go around and he would write down all the very idiomatic expressions of Iraqi Arabic. And he has this, sort of long compilation. And very, very correctly, he perceived that Iraqi Arabic was changing after the invasion, after 2003. And so he wanted to preserve not only how it used to be, but also this moment of transition and all of the new words that were making their way into Iraqi Arabic. So I don't know if I would consider that necessarily low culture. I consider that a work of adab in its own way.
So should we move on from there to masqouf, which almost becomes a person, of course, in the book. It's a dish. It's one I hadn't heard of actually before I read your book. But you can actually eat it in Dubai. I learned today. In any event, it becomes an important focal point in the book. This quest for masqouf, and it also introduces the historical sort of vector of your interest in food. Mm-hmm. So could you either talk about that or read the relevant passage?
The passage about masqouf, but that's also ends up sort of being about this street named after Abu Nawas. This one won't be quite as long, I don't think, as the last reading. There was a phrase Iraqis were always using, the flavor of freedom. For a lot of Baghdadis, that flavor was masqouf. It was more than just a fish or a way of preparing it. The ritual of maskouf embodied a vanished place in time and way of life. Maskouf can be made anywhere. They make it in Basra or even these days in Beirut. But it is meant to be savored in the open-air restaurants on Abu Nuwas, the corniche along the Tigris where Iraqis used to stroll at sunset. Traditionally, the best maskouf was made from barbel, a carp-like fish that Iraqis have been eating since the ancient Mesopotamian days. But maskouf's flavor also came from the hour of anticipation while you waited for your fish. During that hour, people would eat, drink, gamble, and talk. Girls and boys would stroll up and down the corniche, laughing and making eyes at one another. Mothers and fathers would rent boats and float up and down the moonlit river, drinking in the sound of music and laughter over water, the flickering fires, the smell of roasting fish from the riverbank. The important thing on Abu Nuwas was drinking arak, explained Salam, the young communist I had met at Maggie's journalism class, who had become a good friend, and eating meze like jajik while you waited for your fish to be done. Abu Nuwas had its heyday in the 1950s and 60s, when the city rented out small plots along the riverfront every summer. Families would take them for the season and set up temporary wooden ramadas with roofs woven out of river reeds. On hot summer nights, everyone would head for the riverfront to talk, play the oud, take boat rides, and eat maskouf. Some people said maskouf was imported by the Ottomans. Others maintained it was a Babylonian tradition, thousands of years old. Muslims claimed it was a Christian dish, the Christian taste for fish being well known. Christians whispered that it was a specialty from the old Jewish quarter along the river, the Jewish affinity for fish being well known. Some believed it had come from the Mandeans, the Mandean love for the river and its water being well known. I found this frustrating. I wanted facts, dates, scholarly references, not this vague mash of exoticized nostalgia. Everybody talked about maskouf, but nobody knew where it came from. Etymology was no help. As with many Arabic dishes, its name describes the form of the dish more than its contents. Maskouf means the ceilinged, from sa'af, ceiling, or salkaf, actually, in Iraqi Arabic. A poet's description of a fish spread out over the fire like the roof of a little open ramada. Ancient Sumerian tablets mention fish touched by fire, an ambiguous phrase. Herodotus wrote that 3 Babylonian tribes lived on fish alone, but according to his detailed description, they dried their catch in the sun, pounded it in mortars, and made it into cakes or a kind of bread. An Iraqi from the marshland tribes told me that they still make fish this way. Pedro Teixeira, a Portuguese merchant adventurer who traveled through Baghdad in 1604, noted that, quote, fish are plentiful and good, and the Moors used them. But the usually thorough Teixeira does not say how the Moors used the fish. And so it was with all the sources I could find. The more I read, the more people I asked, the more maskouf and its origins receded into mystery. In Iraq, as everywhere, food was an instant geographic indicator. There was the famous black pickle of Najaf, made with date syrup, the tiny delicate okra of Hilla, the tender and juicy kebabs of Fallujah. There was a kind of oven-roasted lamb that is a specialty not just of Basra, but of one particular family in Basra. This culinary GPS system often overlapped with sect. I can enter an Iraqi house, and from the food, I can tell if they are Sunni or Shiite, an Iraqi man once boasted to me. I'm not saying that Sunnis don't make Shiite dishes or vice versa, but you do have certain foods that are associated with certain places. Maskouf was one such dish. It might be made in other cities, but its soul was still in Baghdad. It got its flavor from the Tigris, even when the fish never touched its waters, and from Abu Nuwas Street. Abu Nuwas Street was named after an 8th century poet. He was a companion of the Caliph Al-Amin, son of Harun al-Rashid, the storied Caliph of the Arabian Nights. Nicknamed the father of locks, as in hair, for his luxuriant hair, Abu Nuwas was a bisexual bon vivant, famous for his khamriyat, wine songs, hymns in praise of wine, and the nights he spent drinking it with beautiful girls and boys. He was the patron poet of bars and drinking and unrepentant freedom. Accumulate as many sins as you can, he wrote once, because when Judgment Day arrives and you see how forgiving and gracious God is, you'll gnaw your fingers with regret at all the fun you didn't have. So drink the wine, though forbidden, for God forgives even grave sins. The nomadic bards of pre-Islamic Arabia padded their poems with grandiose invocations like the famous Kifa Nabki, halt and let us weep. They wept over the abandoned campsite, the spot in the desert where the caravan of their lovers had once stopped, and the romance of endless travel. The formula persisted long after poetry moved to the cities, and in medieval Baghdad, citified poets who wouldn't know a camel if it bit them in the behind were still invoking the cold campfire, the traces in the sand, the lost lady love. Abu Nuwas mastered the old nomadic form first, and then he updated it with a parody more suited to modern urban life. This loser stopped to talk to an abandoned campsite, he wrote. It's my paraphrase. Well, I paused to ask what happened to the neighborhood bar. So he's making fun of this old form. The translation actually said, "This wretch stopped to talk to an abandoned campsite." But I have a feeling that Abu Nuwas probably would have used whatever was like the current slang in this case. In the 1960s and 70s, a generation of Iraqi intellectuals discovered a world of ideas, debate, and friendship on Abu Nuwas Street. The Iraqi journalist and memoirist Zuhair al-Jazairi described how Baghdad's relationship to the river changed as the street and its restaurants had evolved. The river became a kind of lung by which the city breathed, a boon for the eye and the spirit. Falah Jabbar grew up in Baghdad during the golden age of Abu Nuwas Street. Today he's a well-known sociologist and author, but back then he was a penniless young student, eking out a living with occasional writing and translation work, producing horrible sentences, that's how he said it, out of his precious Webster's Collegiate Dictionary. Every evening, Jabbar and his circle of friends would gather at Abu Nuwas and spend long summer nights drinking, talking, exchanging books and arguments and ideas. One night, a friend of Jabbar's brought his wife to the cafe. Some of the Maskouf restaurants had introduced family sections where families could eat together. But for young men and women who weren't blood relatives to mingle at cafes and bars, to sit and drink in places where alcohol was served was still shocking. This is like the 60s and the 70s, remember. Nobody had seen anything like it. The place was in an uproar. The owner came to their table. "We don't have a private section for families," he said, meaning no women allowed. "It's none of your business," replied the lady, her green eyes flashing. "I'm drinking tea. Is there anything in the Quran, in the Sharia, or in the law that forbids drinking tea in a cafe with my husband, with my cousins, with all my brothers?" Such a thing could only happen in Abu Nuwas, Jabbar told me, lowering his voice and looking back over his shoulder as if 30 years later the cafe owner might still hear him. Shall I read a bit more? Yeah?
As you like.
Okay. After the Prophet Muhammad's death in 632, the leadership of Islam passed to a succession of caliphs. The caliph was the commander of the faithful, the political and military leader of the worldwide community of Muslims, and the city where he lived was the caliphate, the capital of the Muslim world. In 762, the Caliph al-Mansur moved the caliphate from Syria to Iraq. He built the round city of Baghdad in a small but strategic site on the banks of the Tigris. He christened his new capital Medinat al-Salam, the city of peace, and immediately set about constructing an enormous palace. Then as now, Baghdad was a city of souks. Every profession had its market. The silversmiths, the booksellers, the perfumers. And right in the middle of the bustling marketplace, surrounded by soap makers, butchers, and cooks, stood the caliph's new palace. Just as the palace was finished, an ambassador from the Byzantine Empire came to visit. Scribes and scholars tell different versions of what happened next. Kanya makan, as the storytellers say. Literally, it was and it was not, or once upon a time. But here's more or less what took place. This is a compilation of several different sources. "Indeed, you have built a palace like no one before you," said the ambassador. "Yet it has one flaw, the markets. Because they are open to all, your enemy can enter, and the merchants can pass on information about you. The leader who lives close to his subjects can have no secrets." The caliph frowned, went stiff, and considered flying into a rage. "I have no secrets from my subjects," he said coldly. But as soon as the Byzantine ambassador left, the caliph ordered his servants to bring a white garment. He unfurled it across the table and drafted a new plan for the city on its fabric. He banished all markets from the city center, leaving only a few baqals in Iraqi Arabic, greengrocers whom he barred from selling anything but vinegar and greens. He moved the markets across the river, putting each merchant in a specific place, with the butchers at the very end because their knives are sharp and their wits are dull, as he put it. With a stroke of his pen, he rewrote the city. I won't read the rest of it, but I go on to detail how Saddam did something rather similar with the markets and with Abu Nuwas Street. When he became ever more security conscious, he shut down the open nature of Abu Nuwas Street, and it became sort of more heavily surveilled, more seedy, more depressing. People stopped going there. He actually appropriated part of it for housing for Republican guards and sort of high Ba'ath Party officials. And it's sort of a pretty close parallel, actually, to what the Caliph did in that story.
Great, thank you. So that exemplifies your interest in history, actually, in throughout the book. But in fact, you deal with history with very light brushstrokes. I mean, it's there, and just to give you enough of a sense that there is this deep historical backdrop to all the places that you're talking about. The history of Masqouf, which you end up suggesting is mysterious, but belongs to everyone.
If anyone has like any, ancient stone tablets with Masqouf, let me know right now. Speak now or forever hold your peace, because to this day no one really knows. If there's evidence out there, they haven't found it, where it originated.
But there are a lot of historical passages in the book, whether it be about the recent history of Lebanon or ancient history of Baghdad. And then, of course, there's much evocation of this rich medieval Arabic literature about food, which is very variegated, and we can talk a bit about that. But what I want to say is, I think the history, the light brushstrokes of history work very well because they underpin the book, but they don't smother the book in facts, historical facts.
To use a culinary metaphor.
So do you want to say something about the fact that one of the books could have been actually very historically laden, and in fact you were advised to...
I tell my students, some of whom are here tonight, so sorry, you're hearing a lot of stuff that you've already heard. In journalism, or at least I think good journalism, really 90% of the research and the reporting that you do never makes it into what you write. Unfortunately, it's one of the exciting things and one of the cool things about doing very heavily researched, very in-depth reporting and writing, but also one of the really sad things because you learn all this really cool stuff that you never really get to really go into. So this book, originally the first draft, now it's like around 300 something pages. The first draft was more like 600 or 700. And pretty much all of that stuff that got cut was history. And a lot of it was from the reading that I had done in this body of work that's known as Adab, which can mean a variety of different things. And I think I'll let Phil define it like more specifically and concretely because he's the expert. But a lot of this stuff that I read informed the final work. For example, the passage that I read that you guys just heard about Abu Rifat is heavily informed by this idea of adab, and also by the reading that we'll talk to you about, the reading that my students are doing in the class. Some of the works of medieval Arab writers like Al-Jahiz, like Al-Kindi, like Al-Mas'udi, some of these sort of leading lights of Arabic literature wrote quite a bit about food, as I discovered when I was doing the research for this book. Some of the most famous works of this period, of this era, have a lot to do with food, much as Plato's dialogues kind of center around guys sitting around talking, drinking, eating, and shooting the breeze and staying up all night. A lot of these works are very similar. Should I talk more about that? Or?
So, well, I was just thinking we could talk a bit about these 5 categories, actually, in the history of the treatment of food in medieval Arabic literature, which is really a history very much alive I think, in modern Arabic culture. I mean, whether as a passive knowledge or indeed an active knowledge. But the one source book that you use is the book by Gert-Jan van Gelder called God's Banquet, which is very useful. And he divides, it's really a chronological account of the history of food in Arabic literature. So it goes from pre-Islamic Arabia, as all histories of Arabic literature do, and then introduces adab. So it leaps over the Umayyad period, of course, as all histories, cultural histories do.
Which there was a lot of eating being done there, too, by the way.
It was mostly Bedouin, though. Well, anyway, the Abbasids, of course, had this high culture, the golden age of the Abbasids, in which Persian elements came much more to the fore and influenced culinary delights as well as the literature. And it was the same period that people started to write cookbooks, actually. At the time of Harun al-Rashid, actually, one of the first Arabic cookbook is by Ibrahim ibn al-Mahdi, who was Harun al-Rashid's half-brother. Now, the themes that Van Gelder traces through that chronology are, he starts with that heroic generosity of the Bedouin tribal poet. The heroic generosity, the sort of almost reckless generosity, the ability to be able to hamstring 700 camels in order to, that didn't even belong to you, actually, to give succor and
to feed
food.
some guy who just showed up at his door.
Yes. So that's the famous story of Hatim of Tai, of course, who killed several hundred camels to feed some guests whom he didn't even know, and of course he got into trouble with his father. But the point is that there's a lot of where food occurs in pre-Islamic poetry. It's in the context of the tribal poet boasting of his ability and in the tribal ability insofar as it represents the tribe to be generous, to sacrifice your own well-being if necessary,
and sometimes your life, right?
Sometimes your life, yeah.
These stories of the Bedouin who gave his last bit of water to feed a stranger and then he died.
Of course, the classic poem is Labid's Mu'allaka, who was a great tribal poet. The feeding of the camel that's been sacrificed in a Maser competition, which was the drawing of lots, which was, of course, abolished by Islam, and then inviting to partake of the meat of the slaughtered camel the orphans and the women, the widowed women of the tribe. But in Imran Qais you get a different feeling, actually, because of course his character was so different, and he was a bit of a debauched poet as well as the greatest of all the pre-Islamic poets, and the one, according to the Prophet, who would lead all the poets into hell. That's apocryphal, probably. In any case, in his poetry you have this idea which survives through a lot of the literature, the metaphor of food and sex and love, Famous story of him espying some women and who are swimming naked in the pool, and he sits on their clothes and dares them to come out. There's one woman whom he's after, Neza, of course. He wants to see her. They eventually come out. He gives them their clothes, and to reward them for their generosity of sorts, he slaughters his camel and feeds them. And there's this extraordinary image of the women, after he slaughtered the camel, throwing around the fat at each other. It's not clear whether the fat has been cooked or not, but in any case, it's an extraordinary image. But it leads into a later part of the Mu'allaka where he is more of a tribal poet and describes the feeding of the tribe after the hunt. The second theme is, after this heroic generosity, is that of the economy that comes in with Islam. Of course, Islam introduced the idea of ishrab كل واشرب بس ولا تسرفوا كل واشربوا ولا تسرفوا. So eat and drink, but do not do these things in excess. So there is this idea of restraint that comes in with Islam, but also of enjoying the good things of the earth that have been given to humanity by God. So there's a slight tension that's introduced there. And the most interesting part of the subject, because it's the most of the book, is because it's the most literary, is the section on adab and the idea of food and the textual banquet. That the stories are really food for thought and entertainment, and they often revolve around food. He also has a section on parody, the fact that a lot of the values that were inherent in food and the consumption of food and the sharing of food were parodied in sardonic and satirical and parodic
generosity, greed. And generosity being something that people started, really at about this time, there was a lot of social upheaval going on. There's urbanization. People are moving to Baghdad all of a sudden. There is Persianization going on, that people, tremendous tension between the old Bedouin way of doing things, which is associated with the nomadic lifestyle, which is this reckless generosity of slaughtering 700 camels, and that being considered really unapologetically a good thing. And then suddenly you have people living in cities, a more urbanized ethos, and people saying, well, actually, I'm not sure that's actually the smartest thing. And so that leads to this great work called the Bukhalat, the Book of Misers, by this crazy genius named Al-Jahiz, who's really considered one of the finest stylists of Arabic prose. And he wrote this book in the form of, it's an interesting form. There's kind of, it seems disorganized. It seems like a lot of little stories, much as Chicken Soup for the Soul. A lot of little moral tales, telling sort of little morality plays of, a guy who came to a guy's house and the guy was stingy, and so he was embarrassed and he was ashamed. But it's actually very highly structured. There's actually a series of little stories that lead to one conclusion, and this was characteristic of adab as it was developing at that time. And then there are a series of stories that lead to the opposite conclusion. And then in the middle, I think it's in the middle or toward the end of the book, there's actually a debate, an epistolary debate between two proponents of opposite ways of thought. So on the one hand, you have this argument, generosity is good, and generosity is great, and you will go down in history like Hatem al-Ta'i, who slaughtered 700 camels. And on the other hand, you have this point of view, like, no, that's crazy. You're going to just go broke, and you are going to waste the money that you should be using or saving. Thrift is a virtue that was starting to be, considered important as well at this time. And it's interesting to see within this book how both sides are argued with equal force. Or I don't know about equal force, but they're both argued quite well, let's just put it that way. With Al-Jahiz's writing, you can usually kind of get a feeling for what side he's on. He argues both sides, and this was part of the sort of literary form at the time. But there's usually sort of an indication of which one he's in sympathy with. And this idea of a textual banquet that Philip raised is interesting. I'm going to read a passage. Should I read the Isa Bulata passage describing? The Arabic word adab, now meaning literature and in classical times belles lettres, just means essays and expository prose, means erudition but also good manners. Works of adab usually have a moralistic content that can entertain and simultaneously teach good manners, much as food can nourish and be pleasant tasting at the same time. So it's this idea that food feeds your body, but that we also need to feed our minds at the same time, and that food is something that can actually do both. Food at this time begins to be considered almost like a branch of medicine. Nowadays, I feel like we think of food as being something that's sort of trivial, it's not really important, or it's for celebrities, it's on TV. But at this time, food is considered a serious method and mode of inquiry. Cuisine is considered up there with music and with writing and with literature. And you start to see this genre emerging of stories about food that teach these little sort of lessons about manners and morals and generosity and how one should behave to be a good or proper person. And I should point out, you would know more about this, but scholars think that there is an etymological link between the word adab and the word for banquet.
Madaba, yeah.
Madaba.
So perhaps we can read some, but in the course of discussion, because I think it's important that we allow the audience to join in. I just have one more question before I do that, because I don't think I'll get a chance otherwise to ask it. And I sort of asked you yesterday, but there is this analogy, this metaphor that makes of food, that makes love a metaphor for food and food a metaphor for love, right? So. And this book is about love, war, and food. And of course, it is a love story, as I've said. Now, what's interesting about the book is that in Baghdad, when you were... Well, on certain days, you would explore the markets and explore your own talents, culinary talents, and make things that you'd probably never made before. But, and you were very proud of this, and you write very, very wittily and evocatively about these afternoons and what you produce. But what was interesting is that Muhammad never ate the food. So there's this tension between the fact that food is the sort of vehicle of love, and yet that Muhammad has different tastes from you.
I should say he didn't never eat the food.
Oh, he sometimes ate
Just certain things that my husband doesn't like to eat, such as fish, for example. He's not alone in this. There are many people in the world who don't eat fish. I see some people in the audience have the same experience. Whereas I am notorious for being a person who will eat anything, as my students know. So yeah, there was definitely, and at first it was really hard for me to get used to, because I tended to want to say like, hey, let's all go and eat, this. But then I sort of realized, well, okay, if you don't want to eat fish, then that's just more fish for me, man. But Muhammad would like it to be known that there's a list of things in the book that he doesn't eat, but that now he actually does eat some of them, including eggplant. So So
No, I found that an interesting tension in the book, because it works well as a book, but in a very subtle way as a story of love through food, and that we can all identify with. And yet there are these tensions in life. Not everyone likes the same food.
And maybe you don't have to both eat the same food in order to.
I was fascinated by your description of the cafes and how they function as a public space. Mm-hmm. How like a piazza in Italy, where people can come and listen to Dante under the loggia, or like the Agora, and how they encourage, how they can come and listen to the wise man or discuss ideas. Right. And how you also discuss these ideas of sort of regular contact. There's regulars at the cafe, or the woman that borrows her books at the shop and keeps coming back has regular contact, and how all those contacts encourage sort of educational experiences among people of different cultures, mm-hmm. or trust among locals. And I was wondering, I don't know how well you know Abu Dhabi, but what places you would identify as serving that function in Abu Dhabi? Which ones would you recommend, or maybe which ones would people in the audience recommend? And also, I'd be curious to hear more about how you managed to become a regular in these places, and sort of what strategies you used, and also what techniques you used to sort of record your memories and your observations of the places, like all the details about the photographs. So thank you.
Thank you. That's a lot of food for thought. And really, you mentioned something interesting, which is this function of the lending libraries. A lot of the history in this book is implicit. This is a tradition that's been going on since the 8th, 9th century, actually. And in fact, there's a famous story about Al-Jahiz, probably apocryphal like all the good stories, but I like to think that it's true. That he was actually from a very poor family, non-citizens. There was like a sort of a migrant worker class in Basra at that time. His parents were, at least one parent or grandparent we think was probably Ethiopian or African in some way. And in fact, one of his over 200 books that he wrote is called On the Natural Superiority of Blacks Over Whites, or On the Glory would be a literal translation. So Al-Jahiz was not a rich man, and yet he managed to become one of the most educated, erudite men of his day, possibly, the story goes, by going to the booksellers. There were dozens, hundreds of booksellers at this time in Basra, and a few decades later, hundreds in Baghdad. The historian Al-Yaqubi itemizes over 100 booksellers in the old souks of Baghdad. But in Basra, where Al-Jahiz was coming up, paper was like the new thing. It was like brand new fashion. The first paper mill in the Muslim world had very recently been built. And so suddenly you had all these books and all these booksellers, and he would go to them, and he would go with them in the evening as they were closing and say, do you mind locking me in tonight overnight so that I can just stay up all night reading all your books? I promise I won't mess anything up. And they would come the next morning, and he would have spent the whole night reading, so as not to like disturb their custom. So I thought that was really interesting, and that's sort of something I was thinking of as I was writing that part about Rawat, the translator, and how she learned. And you had many of these spaces in Iraq, in Baghdad, that served this public function, as you noted. Like this was really prime public space, and it was sort of like the public square. And I used to go to Shah Bandar a lot. I used to try to go every Friday until things became difficult. And unfortunately, they quickly became difficult. And one of the reasons why I love these pictures of Shah Bandar is actually because in March of, I want to say 2006 or 7, I think it was 2006, it was actually blown up. And I think a couple of dozen people were killed in Mutanabi Street. Shah Bandar was destroyed. And so all these pictures are very precious to me because it's this sort of space that used to exist. I think a lot of these public spaces are very precious and also very vulnerable for precisely that reason, because they were this sort of mingling and meeting place. As for your question of what places in Abu Dhabi serve that function, I feel like more permanent residents could probably give us a better idea. I have my places that I found and that I like. I would say the Corniche. The Corniche. I mean, there's food, there's people from all over. You see all classes of people. on the public beach. You see, you see high and low, everyone's there. You see, women who are completely covered. You see women who are wearing bikinis. You see men who are wearing dish dashes and who don't trim their beards. You see men who, are clean shaven, and you see it all at the Corniche.
Can I just get back to some of the historical part of your answer, just because I think it's worth saying that adab really feeds into Arabic cookery books. And there is a rich tradition of Arabic cookery books. There are many of them. Some of them have been lost, but we know they existed. The first one was written by Ibrahim ibn al-Mahdi, Harun al-Rashid's brother. And it was used, and it provides a lot of the material in the first extant cookery book, right? Kitab al-Tabikh of Ibn Sayyar al-Waraq from the 10th century, 11th century. But the point about al-Waraq is that it's a nickname. It really means he was a dealer in paper. He was a dealer in books. So it was a bookish person who wrote cookbooks. They were kind of polymathic,
They were medicine, advice about life, and to further expand on this theme, the Abbasid Empire ushered in what we call the golden age of Islam, and it really, part of what made it the golden age was what I call the Abbasid orgy of translation. They really, really went nuts with translating anything and everything they could get their hands on, including a lot of Greek and Roman philosophy, and a lot of South Asian stuff as well. The Western world tends to focus on the Greek and Roman philosophers, but there was a lot of South Asian stuff being translated as well, and so you really had this knowledge from all over the world: China, South Asia, the Greek and Roman stuff. Al-Jahiz was part of a school of philosophers called the Mutazilites, who were big troublemakers, and they read a lot of Greek and Roman philosophy, and they took it very seriously. But a lot of the works of cookery and of sort of adab, which concerned living well, being someone who is not necessarily in the sense of a bon vivant, but also almost in the sense that Machiavelli uses the word virtu, like living a life that is good and admirable, considered cookery. It was considered part of being a smart, educated, well-rounded person, that you would know how to cook. And so in this era, in the time of the 1001 Nights, you have this explosion of cookbooks. You have the caliphs holding what we can really only describe as cook-offs and cooking contests. If any of you have read the full 1001 Nights, you've seen these scenes where someone will come in and they'll bring someone in off the street usually, and they'll say, "Hey, what do you think of this?" And there's a wonderful scene in al-Masudi's Meadows of Gold where they kind of grab this guy off the street and they bring him in. The caliph and his nadims, who were boon companion is how the word nadim is usually translated, but you could also just translate it as drinking buddy. The nadims were the drinking buddies of the caliph. They had to know how to drink, and also, as they put it, how to forget, how to drink enough with the caliph the night before, and then forget it the following morning. But they also had to be poets. They had to be musicians. They had to be cultured men. They had to have a full knowledge of poetry, mathematics. They had to know all of these things. So the caliph would be hanging out with his nadims. They would decide, hey, let's all make some food. I get the sense, reading between the lines, maybe other people were also involved in the making of this food. Maybe they had Syrian cooks or slave cooks, both men and women, interestingly enough, by the way. And one of the most famous stories in the 1001 Nights about this is they bring in this slave girl and they sort of quiz her about her cooking knowledge. And she answers very well. And she's rewarded with many dinars and sort of sent on her way. And you get the sense she's going to be a bit of a court favorite from then on. But there's this great story in Masudi where they're all sitting around talking about food. And they bring in this guy off the street. And they say, "Hey, what do you think of this food?" And he's apparently been briefed on the way in, so he's like, "Oh, this food is," and they have actually 3 different dishes, if I'm remembering correctly. I think you probably know this story better than I do. One of them has been cooked by the caliph. One of them has been cooked by secretary or vizier, and one of them has been cooked by a person of lower rank. So the first one, which has been cooked by the caliph, this is the best food I've ever had, and it's amazing, and you can tell that a real man of skill and culture and wit cooked this, and he points out individual things. And a lot of it's about the language and the beauty of the language that he uses to describe it. And then he moves on to the second one, and he's like, well, this is good, but maybe not as good. And by the third time, he's like, I don't know, I wouldn't eat this. I wouldn't feed this to this is no good. And so, of course, he is duly rewarded and sent on his way. And when you read these, I can't help but think a little bit of Oprah, where you have these scenes where everyone, Oprah's doing her thing and she's talking and she's got people up on stage and they're sort of the equivalent of the viziers and the Nadeems, and talking to the audience, questions of the audience, and and then at the end, because Oprah's happy that day, everyone in the audience gets a car and everyone kind of jumps up and screams and hugs each other, and that's actually not going to happen tonight, unfortunately. But there is going to be food. So we're kind of straying from the topic of adab and kind of falling into shaggy dog stories, but that's very much in the spirit of adab, as pointed out.
Well, just because this image is there, I've got some images of Abbasid dishes, actually. This one is called Ibrahimiya, which comes from a cookbook from the 13th century by Baghdadi, Kitab al-Tabikh. It was named after Ibrahim ibn al-Mahdi, who wrote the first Kitab al-Tabikh that doesn't survive, and it's named after him because it includes ingredients that he favoured, like the mixture of grapes and almonds. Well, it looks very tasty.
So those are big grapes.
Yeah.
Wow.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting, and inshallah I'll go and get the book and give it to my wife. Maybe she can learn a little bit to cook.
There are recipes in back.
Yeah. My question is relating to Ziryab, who came from or originated from the East and ended up in the West.
Yes.
Can you tell us some stories that maybe relate to the topic?
At hand,
Thank you.
Ziryab, with pleasure. So Ziryab, who is claimed by the Persians, something people don't necessarily always talk about, came to the court at this time of, like I said, there was this great tension, right? You have urbanization, you also have Persianization, which is something that became very controversial. And there's a lot of tension within the 1001 Nights and within this era, and specifically in Al-Jahiz's Book of Misers. There's a lot of talk at this time that, there's this manly Bedouin tradition of, killing camels and roasting meat, and it's all very simple, manly food. And then you have this tradition of putting fruit in the food. I mean, who would have heard of such a thing? Grapes in the sauce? A lot of this is Persian food. A lot of this is the sweet and sour taste that is characteristic of Persian food. And the Persianizer and the sort of the cook par excellence in the court, in the Abbasid court,
Sikbaj, which is very Persian,
was this guy named Ziryab, of whom many stories are told, and we don't know which are true, but I'm just going to say that I think all of them are true. He was an amazing musician, an amazing cook, and he is the guy who brought a lot of these recipes, according to legend, to the Iraqi court, and who ushered in this era of these amazing pilafs, these sweet and sour tastes. There's a lot of vinegarization of food at this time. There's a lot of adding vinegars and rose water and scented stuff at this time. And if you read contemporary accounts of Ziryab, he was not only the guy who introduced a lot of recipes, but he introduced a lot of customs, things like eating asparagus, which we saw in one of the pictures. We have, legend has it that we have that thanks to Ziryab, that he was the man who said, hey, you can eat this stuff, and it's actually really good. He is also credited with the invention or with the popularization of the idea of eating with utensils. And he's also credited, and I think rightly so, with the idea of eating food in courses. That you didn't just put it all out at once, but that you would have courses, starting with like a light soup, maybe moving on to pilaf, something more complicated, and then ending with nuts. And the phrase "from soup to nuts" actually is sometimes credited all the way back to Ziryab. It's like a very 20th century phrase, but actually goes back to this idea that Ziryab brought to the Iraqi court, to the Abbasid court, of starting off with a soup, with something that was very simple, and then ending up, and then going into like very, very complicated dishes, and then ending up with something very simple like nuts or fruit. He was also an amazing musician. There's all these stories of Ziryab, and in fact, Ziryab later emigrated to Cordoba. It's Cordoba, right? To Andalusia, because he was so good a musician that he put his teacher, who was, let's say, it wasn't Ibrahim. Anyway, his teacher, who was also a big man in the court. Does anyone remember the teacher? Yes.
Ibrahim mostly.
There was one of these contests. They would have cooking contests. They would also have poetry contests. They would also have musical contests. And so the legend has it that Ibrahim
Al-Mawsili.
Mosoli, the dude from Mosul, Moslawi, who was Ziryab's teacher, had been surpassed by his pupil. And said, I think in the legend, I think in the story he says like, you can't even, he didn't even let him compete, right? Or is it that he did compete and then he put him to shame? Anyway, his teacher knew that he'd become the better musician, and so he told him like, look, it's you or me. There isn't room for both of us in this town. Ziryab fled to Andalusia, to the Cordoban court, and brought the food with him. And this is why Andalusian food retains many of the characteristics that we find in medieval Arabic cookery. In fact, if you show the Ibrahimiyya...
The escabeche.
Escabeche, yes. Escabeche is based on the Persian sikbaj.
Which is this.
Which is this.
Which is a vinegar, sweet and sour dish.
But the little meatballs that we saw on the corner of the plate, and yes, these are most likely, I don't know this individual recipe, but the little meatballs that were put in soup from this time on were known as al-bunduqiyya, which means bunduk is hazelnut, so they were like the hazelnutty things. And those traveled to the Cordoba, to the Andalusian cuisine, and they live on to this day as albondigas in Spanish, in Spanish cooking. And we have Ziryab to thank for this.
Hi. We've come all the way from Dubai to see you tonight. We're very, very happy that you're here.
Thank you so much.
We used your book in our book club at the school where our kids go. Anyway, the interesting thing that I personally found about your book was less, I'm sorry for not being the intellectual that I should be, less the etymology and the history and more the fact that it was about survival and the smallest common denominator about survival in human beings, which is food. Being someone who grew up in the war in Lebanon, I could really understand that so much, because a lot of people think that we lived very tragic childhood, where in fact a lot of the time it was comic and light because of food and things like food.
Right.
And there was a point in your book that really meant a lot to me, where you're describing a situation that was very, very dangerous and difficult, where you were bringing Americans from the green, what is it called? The green zone, to meet some clerics or some religious leaders.
The sheikh.
And the food was on the table and it was smelling beautiful, and you wanted so much to taste it, but you couldn't because they hadn't started. And then the electricity went off, and you were thinking in your mind, we're all going to die. And all you could think of was, I have to taste this before I die. And I think all of us who have been in situations like this understand that so well, because in fact, food is one of the escapes, I think, that help you think of death and war in a more acceptable way. Do you have...
How do you say you're not intellectual?
Can you comment about this? Because really, although what you've been saying is very interesting, I would like to know about how you saw survival and food in war connect.
Right. It's a really, really, really perceptive question, and a really good question, and I think it's very funny that you said you're not intellectual, because I think that you actually are. But part of what I was trying to convey, I think you sort of grasped the theme of this book and articulated even better than I could have. Food becomes a symbol and a metaphor in the book, and part of what I was trying to do was to show common humanity in one way, right? And also what Shakespeare would call like the milk of human kindness, and this idea that war is horrible and terrible and destructive, and that's what a lot of the book is about. But also, people fight back against war. People do things during wars that are the antithesis of war. And cooking with each other and feeding each other is part of that. It's part of what I call the war against the war, or the secret war, or the underground war that takes place behind the scenes. And it is about survival. And simply surviving and helping other people survive can be one of those things that helps us fight against war rather than fight in wars. And that's what a huge part of the book is about. That's sort of what if I want, if people take away one thing from the book, I hope that it's that.
I live in Italy, ecco. And I just wanted to actually say that I was invited this evening by my friend to assist, and I didn't know what to expect. I've been living in Italy since 1995. And you've just given so much depth to something that I've never been able to understand in a way. And a little bit you were saying how people are impressed by the fact that in Baghdad people eat cakes, and how maybe people are completely normal in other places of the world.
Right.
In Italy, I have the pleasure, really, or even the honor, to know a lot of people who are 80, 90, even 93 years old. My wife's grandfather died at 95, and when he died, they said, "Oh, no one was expecting it." And I thought, if you don't expect it at 95,
when do you expect it?
When should you expect? I don't know. And when I talk to these people, everyone remembers the war, and World War II in Italy was tremendously horrible. It was horrible when the Germans came down, and it was horrible when the Americans came in. There were more deaths in Italy after World War II finished than there was actually during the war. And everyone that I talk to, ironically, I say ironically, although you're giving a lot of light to it, talk about what they ate and how they could eat and what eating meant and what the Germans did when they would come in. They would take the cow, and how they have recipes with dried bread, not because they like dried bread, but because they would only have dried bread, and then they would make soups. And how they have certain stews. Il minestrone is not something that you actually calculate. It's just everything that kind of you can scrounge up. But it's great. And even things like pasta e fagioli. In Italy, we say that we're not friends until we eat pasta e fagioli. And we don't say it that way. We just say, "Oh, we haven't eaten pasta e fagioli." Calm down. And pasta e fagioli is just beans and pasta. And there's no logic in actually putting them together. Mm-hmm. But if that's the only protein you have, then and they always bring me back when I talk to them to World War II, mm-hmm. and after World War II. And you've given this depth, in fact, I bought your last hard copy outside. I couldn't hesitate. It's giving me something that when I go back and talk to them, and they're going to say, "Oh, well, in the war, we didn't have anything to eat." And I'll say, "Well, wait a second, because now I've got a story to tell you. In Lebanon, in Iraq, there was a war, although it wasn't 70 years ago."
Right.
Yeah? So I just wanted to share that. Thank you.
Well, it's interesting, right? It gets to her question as well, and like her comment. Part of this idea of adab, this idea that you would have a bunch of guys sitting around recording just the everyday things, right? Book of Misers is a book about a lot of guys sitting around talking about eating. And so-and-so, I went to so-and-so's house the other day, and he didn't have any bread. What a miser. A lot of the book is that. It is at the same time a very serious intellectual book on a very important topic, generosity versus thrift. Which is more important? To be a good person, what should you be? And with wars, the civilian aspect of life, everyday people just living their lives, not having food, having to sit in the dark, not having electricity, not having water, things like this, is often not taken very seriously. it's often not considered an important topic in war journalism, but also in history, in war histories. How many times do you read about World War II? You don't hear any mention that these people in Italy, Greece, Bengal, they were starving to death. That is also an aspect of war. And so I think that there's actually this really important thing about the concept of adab, the idea that you should also be writing about the reality of people's everyday lives, right?
But I want just to mention in the book of Al-Mas'udi, Muruj al-Dhahab, he mentioned many recipes and also poetry, like
Yes.
he described the lozenge and the kunafa and all of that.
The Narjasiya
Yeah.
has, because it's the eyes, the eggs are compared to eyes. So you have the eyes of the beloved. So a love poem is written about the Narjasiya.
We actually, Philip and I actually brought a bunch of printouts of stories from Al-Masudi, and we were going to read them, but we ran out of time. So,
But I mean, the book, if I wanted to read the book, is it about history of the food, or is it about the history of the area through food? And I mean, you spoke a lot about Iraq, but you have not spoken about Beirut or Damascus, or maybe you just mentioned because your husband is Iraqi, yes? And I hope at the end that you are a good cook then.
well, there are recipes, so you can find out. My husband's Lebanese, and the book is very personal. It's a memoir, so it's not comprehensive. So even though I spent some time in Damascus, I wrote about it, politics and unimportant things. The book focuses on Beirut and Baghdad. It's not comprehensive, so it's not like a sort of a guide to all the food. Rather, it's using food as a way to talk about people that I knew, such as Abu Rifat, for example, and people that I knew and met and encountered in both places. So
There is masgoof here, by the way, in Abu Dhabi. if you are looking.
there is masgoof everywhere now because of the great diaspora of refugees out of Iraq. You can find it in Damascus, you can find it in Amman, you could probably find it in New York if you looked hard enough.
Oh, great. Well, so without further ado, please join me in thanking Annia.
Thank you.